Nate Whitaker had always found calm in the fall air of the Ozark Mountains, especially when the leaves began to crisp and the morning fog curled around the tree trunks like something alive. He had been planning this hunting trip for months, mapping trails and checking gear, circling the weekend in red on the calendar he and Rachel kept by the fridge. It was their 7th wedding anniversary, and while others might celebrate with candlelight dinners or beach vacations, Nate and Rachel had always shared a deeper love for the wilderness. The trip was meant to be a retreat, a chance to disconnect, a chance to breathe in the quiet that only the woods could offer. They left on a Friday afternoon, the back of their truck loaded with camping supplies, hunting gear, and Buck, their bloodhound, who had been with them since their 2nd year of marriage. They stopped for gas in Van Buren, Missouri, and grabbed a couple of coffees from the station's worn counter. The attendant remembered them laughing over a joke that only they seemed to understand, Buck wagging his tail outside like he knew it was going to be a good trip. That would be the last time anyone saw them. When the couple failed to return home by Sunday night, Rachel's sister Marlene grew concerned. Nate's phone went straight to voicemail, and Rachel had not responded to a single message since Saturday morning. At first, no one panicked. Nate was known for turning his phone off during camping trips, and Rachel had done the same on more than one occasion. But when Monday passed with no word, and neither of them showed up for work on Tuesday, Marlene filed a missing persons report. By Wednesday morning, a search and rescue operation was underway. Dozens of volunteers, police officers, and canine teams combed the Ozark trails. Nate's truck was found parked in a gravel clearing just off a fire road near Big Spring. It was locked. Inside were their phones, their wallets, and both their jackets. A cooler filled with uneaten food sat on the passenger floor, and Buck's leash was still coiled on the back seat. For the first week, searchers scoured the forest with helicopters and thermal drones, following every ridge and ravine. No one found a tent. No one found gear. It was as if Nate, Rachel, and Buck had simply vanished. On the 10th day, a hiker stumbled upon Buck tied to a tree 2 miles from where the truck had been discovered. The dog was thin, his eyes bloodshot, but he was clean free of burrs or cuts and astonishingly calm. His water dish had been filled recently, and a half-eaten can of food sat beside him. The rope used to tie him was looped expertly, a hunter's knot that Nate would have used. Search teams redoubled their efforts, believing now that the couple might still be alive somewhere, perhaps injured, maybe even hiding. But no signs emerged. Not a footprint, not a shred of clothing, not a single spent bullet casing. By late November, the formal search was suspended. Authorities floated theories. They suggested a fall, perhaps a fatal misstep on rocky terrain, or an encounter with a wild animal. Bears were not uncommon in that part of Missouri. But when pressed, the sheriff admitted no blood had been found, no drag marks, nothing to suggest violence. Some speculated they had staged their disappearance, but Rachel's credit cards and bank account remained untouched. Nate's passport was found inside a drawer at home. Nothing added up. As the months passed, the case fell into the cold file drawer like so many before it. The Whitaker family mourned without certainty, their grief hanging in limbo. Then, 2 years later, in the early summer of 2021, something impossible happened. At a gas station in Eminence, Missouri, a clerk named Donna Griggs was opening for the day when she saw a limping bloodhound staggering toward the convenience store. His fur was filthy, his body skeletal, and a large scab stretched over his left hind leg. But the moment she saw his eyes, she recognized him. She had seen his photo on dozens of missing posters 2 years ago. The dog's name was Buck. He had somehow survived 2 winters, 2 summers in one of the most unforgiving patches of forest in the Midwest. But that was not the most shocking part. Around his chest he wore what looked like a handmade cloth vest. Donna called animal control immediately, and by the time the truck arrived, a small crowd had gathered. The dog was exhausted, barely able to hold himself up, but he let the animal control officer lift him gently into the van. The vest was old denim, frayed at the seams and stitched with red thread across the back, where the words in crooked human handwriting "Do not trust him." A zippered pocket on the side revealed something stranger still. Inside was a plastic thumb drive sealed in a sandwich bag. It had no label, no writing, no obvious clues. The sheriff's office took the drive into custody and sent it to the lab for processing. A local IT technician was called in for assistance and managed to extract a set of grainy images. The files were dated October 7, 2019, a week after Nate and Rachel vanished. The photo showed a man in camouflage dragging a long object through a wooded ravine. The object was wrapped in green tarp. The man's face was partially visible in one of the frames. He wore a tan ball cap, and the brim did little to hide the fact that he had a large scar along his left cheek. The technician printed the images and brought them to Sheriff Carlisle. The sheriff stared in silence for nearly a minute before placing the photo on his desk and quietly stepping out of the room. His deputy, a young officer named Jenna Fields, picked up the photo and froze. She recognized the man. He was one of their own. His name was Miles Rourke. He had been part of the original search party. He had stood in that very office shaking the hands of grieving family members and promising to bring their loved ones home. The thumb drive and Buck's return changed everything. The cold case had a pulse again. The silence of 2 years was broken not by evidence, not by witness accounts, but by a loyal dog carrying the weight of something darker than anyone could have imagined. Buck had found his way home. Now the question was whether the truth would follow. Sheriff Carlisle did not sleep the night Buck returned. He stayed in his office long after the staff had gone home, staring at the printed photographs and replaying every moment of the 2019 search in his mind. The photo of Deputy Rourke dragging what looked like a tarp-covered body made Carlisle feel physically ill. He had trusted Rourke. The man had worked on the force for over a decade and had volunteered countless hours to the initial search for Nate and Rachel. Carlisle recalled how Rourke had insisted on leading the search parties through the deeper parts of the forest, claiming he knew the terrain better than most. Now, Carlisle wondered if that had been a tactic to mislead the investigation. Still, the photos were blurry and incomplete. He needed more than suspicion. He needed proof that Rourke had done something criminal. By sunrise, Carlisle had ordered a team to verify the GPS timestamps on the photos and cross-reference them with Rourke's known location during that same time frame. If Rourke had lied about where he was on that day, they would finally have a trail to follow. The tech team pulled up the original logs from the search effort and matched them to radio communications. According to the records, Rourke had been assigned to Zone C on the day the photos were taken. Zone C was a heavily wooded slope near the southern ridge of the park boundary. The photos, however, were geotagged several miles north of that area, closer to a rarely used fire road called Miller's Spur. When confronted with the discrepancy Rourke claimed he had detoured to follow a lead on fresh footprints he believed belonged to Nate. He wrote in his search notes that the trail went cold and that he returned to his original zone within 2 hours. Carlisle requested Rourke's vehicle GPS logs from that day, but the system had been offline due to a reported malfunction. Rourke had submitted a written maintenance ticket the morning of the search. Carlisle began to wonder whether the malfunction had been real or staged. He ordered a forensic review of the vehicle system and requested access to Rourke's personal cell phone data from the week of the search. Meanwhile, Marlene Whitaker, Rachel's sister, began her own investigation. She had never accepted the official conclusion that the couple had died in the woods. The lack of evidence, the abandonment of the search, and the silence from law enforcement had haunted her for years. When Buck returned with the vest and thumb drive, she felt both vindicated and terrified. She began reviewing old voicemails and texts from Rachel in the days before the disappearance. One stood out. It was dated 4 days before the trip and read simply, "I am not sure I trust the new guy. He seems too interested in where we are going." Marlene had no idea who Rachel was referring to at the time. Now, she suspected it might have been Rourke. She brought the message to Sheriff Carlisle and insisted they investigate anyone who had known about the Whitakers' travel plans prior to their departure. Carlisle agreed and expanded the list of persons of interest to include anyone in Rachel's workplace, Nate's National Guard unit, and those in the local hunting community. That afternoon, the sheriff received a call from a volunteer who had participated in the original search. The man, a retired postal worker named Henry Colson, said he had seen Rourke loading something into the back of his truck on the third day of the search. At the time, Colson thought it was just extra supplies, but he remembered Rourke acting nervous and snapping at him when he got too close. Carlisle asked if Colson had seen what was inside the truck, but the older man shook his head. The windows had been tinted and the bed was covered. Still, the timing aligned with the movement in the photos. Carlisle asked Colson to write a formal statement and passed it to the state investigators who had now joined the case. With pressure mounting, the sheriff's office planned to bring Rourke in for questioning again this time, with a warrant for his home and vehicle. Before the warrant could be served, Rourke disappeared. His patrol vehicle was found abandoned near a boat launch at the edge of the Current River, the keys still in the ignition. His badge gun and personal phone were missing. Divers searched the water, but there was no sign of him. Some officers believed he had taken his own life. Others suspected he was running. Carlisle was convinced of the latter. Rourke had always been a survivalist. He had once spent a month alone in the Mark Twain National Forest just to prove he could live off the land. Carlisle believed Rourke had a plan and a destination. He issued a regional bolo alert and brought in canine units to track his scent from the vehicle. The trail led to a nearby hiking path but vanished after 2 miles. A possible car pickup was suspected. The sheriff contacted the FBI. Later that week, a private tracker from Arkansas called in a tip. He had been setting up game cameras in the forest near the state border when he noticed a man camped near a creek bed. The man fit Rourke's description and became aggressive when questioned. The tracker left and later found one of his cameras smashed. The footage captured only one clear image of the man's back, but the clothing matched Rourke's hunting gear. The sheriff sent deputies to the area, but the campsite was already abandoned. Left behind were cans of food, a fire still warm, and a knife stained with what appeared to be deer blood. No other evidence was found. The trail was cold again. 2 days later, something stranger happened. Rachel's phone, which had been inactive for nearly 2 years, pinged a cell tower 40 miles north of the original search site. The signal lasted only 12 seconds before it cut off. Authorities traced the signal to a burner phone used to reroute calls likely intended to mislead them. Still, it raised questions. Was someone taunting them? Or had the phone been in use all this time? Carlisle sent a request to triangulate the signal but found the area too broad to narrow down. Marlene believed it was real and pushed the sheriff to reopen searches in that new sector. A team was deployed, but after 3 days they found nothing. Summer brought a cruel kind of clarity to Marlene Whitaker, as the heat settled over Springfield and the humidity pressed like a weight on every breath. 2 years had passed since her sister vanished, and for many in the community time had dulled the urgency. Faces that once expressed concern now showed polite discomfort whenever the topic came up. People wanted to move on, but Marlene could not. She spent most evenings reviewing old case files, search maps, and timelines, her apartment filled with sticky notes and printed photographs. The return of Buck and the sudden disappearance of Deputy Rourke had reignited something in her that would not let her sleep. She believed there was more buried in the silence than most people were willing to admit. The ping from Rachel's phone still lingered in her mind. Whether it was a decoy or a breadcrumb, she believed someone was still playing a game. And she was determined not to be a passive participant. A breakthrough came unexpectedly one Saturday morning when Buck's veterinarian called with results from a full physical exam. Buck had been recovering slowly, gaining weight and energy, but something odd had been found in the folds of his vest. The vet's assistant had taken the garment home to wash it more thoroughly and discovered a small tear in the lining. Inside was a laminated photo folded tightly and hidden between the seams. The picture showed a dirt trail leading into a thicket of trees. The trail was marked with an orange ribbon tied to a branch. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was the corner of a sign that read Hartley's Bluff. The photo had no timestamp and no clear context, but Marlene recognized the name. Hartley's Bluff was part of an old fire trail system rarely used anymore. The original search teams had not focused there because it was deemed inaccessible by vehicle. But now the bluff became their new focal point. A team was assembled quietly. Sheriff Carlisle did not want media attention until they had something concrete. Officers, a canine unit, and 2 forest rangers were sent to scout the bluff. Buck was brought along still fragile but alert. When the team reached the base of Hartley's Bluff, Buck became visibly agitated, pulling against the leash and barking toward a split in the rock wall. Behind the split was a narrow trail, overgrown and barely walkable, that led into a ravine littered with fallen branches and slick moss. The team pushed forward. After nearly 40 minutes of hiking, they reached a small clearing that looked untouched by recent human activity. But Buck's reaction intensified. He pawed at the ground near a moss-covered boulder and barked until officers began digging. 6 inches beneath the soil, they uncovered a metal box the size of a shoe. It was rusted and dented, but still sealed. Inside the box was a waterproof notebook wrapped in plastic. The first page read, "Property of Rachel Whitaker." Marlene's hand shook as she flipped through the pages. The writing was Rachel's unmistakable in its slanted, careful script. The entries began the day after their disappearance. Rachel wrote of being taken of blindfolds of isolation. She mentioned being kept underground or somewhere without light. She wrote of hearing Nate's voice nearby but never seeing him. She described being given food, water, and a bucket. She wrote about days blending into weeks, about someone visiting at night wearing gloves and never speaking. Rachel's entries grew more desperate. She tried to guess time by counting the intervals between meals. She believed they were being watched constantly. The last entry was different. It was not a log, but a message. She wrote that if someone found the journal, they should not trust the search team. She did not name Rourke, but she wrote that the man who visited her smelled like tobacco and pine oil. Rourke was known for chewing tobacco and kept pine-scented air fresheners in his truck. Back at the sheriff's office, the notebook was authenticated and treated as evidence. Carlisle held it like something sacred, aware of what it represented. It confirmed they had been alive after the disappearance and that someone had held them. The sheriff felt a sick twist in his stomach, knowing the investigation had once included Rourke on the search team. Now he understood why they had found nothing. Rourke had known where not to look. Carlisle released a partial statement to the public confirming that new evidence had been discovered. He did not mention the notebook's contents, but promised transparency once the investigation developed further. Marlene objected, but the sheriff insisted they could not compromise what could soon become a federal case. Meanwhile, Buck's presence continued to stir quiet attention. A woman named Cheryl Barnes, a retired wildlife photographer, contacted Marlene after seeing a news story about the dog's return. She believed she had photographed Buck recently near a gas station in Eminence, but not just once. She had captured a series of night photos from her motion-activated trail camera outside her property located roughly 80 miles from where Buck had first disappeared. The earliest photo was from 2 months before Buck turned up at the gas station. In one of the images, Buck was seen standing in front of the camera, looking directly into the lens, appearing well-fed. In another, taken 3 days later, he appeared thinner and limping. But what stood out was a third image, where Buck was walking beside a man whose face was partially obscured by a hood. The man's left hand held something small, possibly a flashlight or a leash. Cheryl submitted the original SD card to authorities. The sheriff's office enhanced the images and ran facial recognition software, but the hood obscured the man's features too well. The man's height and build were consistent with Rourke, but that alone was not enough. What concerned Carlisle most was the timeline. Buck had likely been moving from location to location for weeks, possibly being released only when Rourke felt it would cause confusion or serve his purpose. The idea that Buck had not escaped but been sent on purpose haunted Marlene. It suggested a plan. It suggested intelligence. Someone had trained the dog, clothed him, equipped him with a message, and let him go. Someone believed Buck could deliver the truth when no one else could. The notebook changed everything. Sheriff Carlisle stood in the center of his office, hands gripping the edge of his desk while agents from the FBI sat across from him reviewing copies of Rachel's journal and the trail camera images. They spoke in hushed voices, taking turns flipping through files and typing notes into encrypted laptops. The presence of federal agents brought a new gravity to the case. Carlisle had seen his share of disappearances, but he had never witnessed a situation where the victim's own words resurfaced after years of silence to accuse a fellow officer. Rachel's descriptions were consistent. She had not been lost. She had not suffered an accident. She had been taken. The evidence now demanded a wider lens, one that reached beyond the boundaries of the county. The FBI opened a formal investigation into potential organized criminal activity involving current and former law enforcement. Carlisle felt sick when they asked for his department's personnel files. Every officer was now a subject of scrutiny. Within 48 hours, the FBI established a mobile command unit at the edge of Hartley's Bluff. Drones were deployed to scan the forest for signs of man-made structures. Using the journal's references, they calculated a likely radius of travel for both Nate and Rachel during captivity. The notebook referenced a dripping sound that grew louder after rainfall, which geologists identified as consistent with runoff from the bluff's northern slope. Teams searched the area and uncovered a collapsed entryway partially hidden by deadfall and vines. Inside was a man-made shelter carved into limestone reinforced with old railroad ties. There were signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust, an extinguished fire, packaged food wrappers that matched local convenience store brands. Most telling of all was a scratched message in the wall, faint but readable. It read, "He is one of you." The agents documented the site thoroughly before sealing it off. Forensics confirmed human DNA on several items, including strands of hair later matched to Rachel. Marlene was notified immediately. She stood with Sheriff Carlisle at the site, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She did not cry. She had cried too much in the last 2 years. Instead, she watched the agents work and asked one quiet question. Could my sister have still been alive until recently? The agent responded carefully. Based on decomposition timelines and the state of the shelter, it was entirely possible that Rachel had lived beyond the initial months. No body had been found. No blood evidence suggested she had died there. The possibility left Marlene reeling. If Rachel had lived into the second year, what had changed? What had led to her silence? The FBI believed Rachel's body might have been moved. Search teams expanded the grid, but the thick forest swallowed light and sound in equal measure. They needed more than guesswork. Later that week, a new witness came forward. A man named Clay Jensen, a former deputy who had retired shortly before the Whitakers disappeared, contacted the FBI and requested to speak with them off-record. He met agents at a diner 2 towns over and handed them a torn notebook filled with names and dates. He claimed Rourke had approached him in late 2018 with an offer to join a side business involving the exchange of unregistered firearms. Jensen refused, but he noted Rourke's confidence. Rourke said he had protection and that some of it came from inside. He never named names. The FBI ran the notes through their database and found that several names matched individuals recently indicted for gun trafficking across state lines. It suggested a larger network. If Rourke had taken Nate and Rachel, it might not have been a personal act, but a calculated move tied to that network. Carlisle authorized immediate interviews with Rourke's known associates. They started with former academy classmates, then shifted to members of the local hunting club, where Rourke had maintained an off-grid cabin. The cabin sat on private land and was notoriously difficult to access. A team flew in by helicopter and approached on foot. The place had been recently abandoned. Inside, they found canned food survivalist manuals and multiple cell phones with removed SIM cards. There was no sign of Nate or Rachel, but behind a loose panel in the wall they discovered a locked metal box. Inside were maps marked with red circles and notes in Rourke's handwriting. One note read, "Keep them quiet until pickup." Another read, "Dog knows the way." Marlene was shown the documents and immediately felt a chill. It was confirmation that Buck had not escaped, but had been released with a purpose. She had said this before, but now it was undeniable. Someone had used Buck to send a message. One of the maps included a location unfamiliar to law enforcement. It marked a water treatment plant built in the 1970s, abandoned after a flood and never reclaimed. The area was remote, surrounded by thick forest, and cut off from major roads. The FBI deployed a tactical team supported by local deputies. The plant appeared deserted at first, but on the second level behind a rusted door they found a sealed room. Inside were items belonging to Nate: his watch, his boots, a duffel bag containing dog treats identical to those Buck preferred. There was also an envelope addressed simply to anyone. The letter inside was handwritten in a tight, trembling script. It began with the words, "If you are reading this, I am likely dead or close to it." It detailed how Nate had been taken by force blindfolded and moved multiple times. He had tried to escape once and was beaten. He had been separated from Rachel early on. The captors wore masks and spoke little, but one of them had a tattoo on his wrist in the shape of a pine tree. Rourke had that same tattoo. The letter ended with a plea. "Tell my brother I never gave up. Tell Marlene that Rachel fought harder than anyone. Tell Buck I am sorry I let him go." Agents took the letter into evidence. They suspected it was written weeks before Buck had reappeared. The plant was processed for DNA, and bloodstains were found under one of the grates. Samples were sent to the lab for analysis. As the search deepened, the FBI began compiling a list of officers across Missouri suspected of corruption. The scope widened quickly. Carlisle felt the weight of it all pressing down on his chest. It was no longer just about one couple. It was about something larger, something that had been allowed to fester beneath the surface for years. The heat that summer pressed against the Ozarks like a living thing, thick and heavy and patient. Sheriff Carlisle watched the sun rise over the ridge behind the station, his thoughts still circling the discoveries from the water treatment plant. He had not stopped replaying the words in Nate's letter, especially the part that said, "Buck knows the way." It was too deliberate to be metaphor. Buck had returned wearing a vest, had carried a photo, and had led searchers to Hartley's Bluff. He was not simply a survivor. He was a messenger. Carlisle met with the FBI that morning and proposed something bold. If Buck knew the route from wherever Nate had last been held, perhaps his instincts could guide them again. The agents hesitated at first, questioning the usefulness of relying on animal behavior after 2 years of trauma and malnutrition. Carlisle countered with logic. Buck had navigated to eminence from a remote, unknown location across multiple miles of terrain. That meant his path could be retraced. The K-9 handlers were brought in to assess Buck's capacity. Though his limp remained, his senses appeared intact. He responded to voice commands, recognized certain scents, and showed increased awareness in wooded environments. Carlisle rode with Buck and his handler to the water treatment facility. There, they released the bloodhound within the fenced perimeter and allowed him to choose a direction. Buck sniffed the ground, then moved north, pausing briefly at a collapsed gate before pressing forward into a corridor of overgrown brush. The team followed, moving slowly to avoid damaging potential evidence. Buck led them for over 3 miles through thick vegetation and 2 dry creek beds before stopping near a fallen tree. At first, there was nothing unusual about the spot, but as the agents swept the area, they discovered a buried trash bag containing a burner phone, a used roll of duct tape, and a torn page from a National Guard field manual. The manual page contained handwritten notes in block letters. It referenced locations used in survival training and included a phrase that caught every agent's attention: "Hold until call." The items were bagged and logged, and the team marked the coordinates for further exploration. Carlyle could not shake the idea that Rourke had built a pattern around misdirection. He had chosen places off maps, properties long forgotten, or locations that once held purpose but now lay abandoned. The question was whether someone else was helping him move from site to site. Rourke had been missing for weeks. He had experience in the woods, but even the best survivalists needed supplies, transportation, and silence. Someone was keeping him invisible. Back at the station, Marlene reviewed the dog's trail with the agents. She pointed out something the others missed. The torn page from the field manual was from the same edition Nate had used during his guard service. She had seen that manual countless times on his desk. It meant Rourke had access to Nate's personal belongings even before the kidnapping, or that someone had taken items from Nate's home or locker without raising alarm. The FBI began interviewing members of Nate's former guard unit, focusing on any transfers or discharges around the time of the disappearance. One name emerged quickly: Mark Hess. A former logistics sergeant with a history of disciplinary issues had left the service under unclear circumstances in late 2018 and relocated to southern Missouri. His last known address was less than 20 miles from the first shelter site. Agents drove to Hess's residence, a weathered single-wide trailer at the end of a gravel road bordered by trees and barbed wire. No one answered the door. A neighbor reported that Hess had not been seen for over a week. A search warrant was issued, and inside the trailer they found gun parts, prepaid phones, and a ledger containing names, dates, and numbers. One page had Rourke's name beside a series of payments marked with a $sign and the word transfer. Another column listed initials that matched Rachel's and Nate's. In a locked drawer, they found 2 sets of military dog tags. The first matched Nate Whitaker. The second matched a soldier who had died in Afghanistan in 2014. The tags had likely been stolen and repurposed for identification fraud. The agents now believed they were dealing with an operation that went far beyond one man. Rourke was not simply a rogue cop. He was a cog in a network that specialized in moving people, laundering weapons, and silencing threats. Nate had been taken because of what he had uncovered. Rachel had been collateral. Buck had been the anomaly, a trained bloodhound with a powerful instinct to return home and a memory no one had accounted for. That mistake had unraveled years of secrecy. Carlyle held Buck's head gently in his hands that evening, looking into the dog's tired eyes and whispering words the animal could not understand. "You brought them back to us." As teams followed the leads from the ledger, another pattern emerged. The payments to Rourke had stopped 2 weeks before Buck's return. The last note beside Rourke's name read, "Delivery complete." It suggested a shift in the plan. The FBI speculated that Rourke had been ordered to move Nate one final time, or to dispose of him altogether. Instead, he had released the dog. Whether it was guilt or strategy, they could not say. But the implications were clear. Rourke had gone against his orders, and someone above him had likely issued a kill command. That would explain the broken timeline, the sudden silences, and the abrupt closure of the last known shelter. Nate had become expendable, and Rourke had become a target. The agents began reviewing satellite data for areas between the water plant and the ridge where Buck had last been seen. A new zone was marked for intensive search. It was an old trapper's line no longer maintained by the Forestry Service. Buck had paused there briefly during his initial walk. Now, with more detail and focus, the agents returned to that point and fanned out. Under a rotting log covered in mushrooms and lichen, they found a camouflaged tarp buried with stones. Inside was a single boot. It was military issue, the same brand Nate had worn. Nearby they found a fire ring long cold with a scorched paper label from an MRE package. It confirmed what they feared. Nate had been there. He had eaten there. He had likely slept there, but he had moved on. The day Rachel's second journal surfaced was overcast and humid, a Missouri summer, pressing its weight down on every surface. Marlene sat in the back of the sheriff's SUV, parked near Hartley's Bluff, sipping warm water and reviewing case notes when her phone buzzed. A local hiker named Luke Merriman had called the tip line that morning. He had been bushwhacking through a thick grove northeast of the ravine, where the first shelter had been found when he spotted a flash of pale fabric tangled in the underbrush. Thinking it was trash, he pulled it free and found a torn shirt wrapped around a sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag was a small notebook wrapped in aluminum foil, water-stained but mostly intact. The first few pages had smeared ink, but the later entries were readable. The handwriting matched the previous journal. It was Rachel's again. The hiker, unaware of the ongoing details of the case, had turned the notebook in at a ranger station. The ranger, recognizing the name on the first page, immediately contacted the sheriff's office. The notebook was brought to the FBI command trailer and gently laid open under an evidence light. Rachel's second journal began weeks after the first had ended. The tone was different. The writing was sharper, less hopeful, edged with frustration and suspicion. She detailed how the visits from her captors had grown less frequent, and that her food supply had been reduced to the bare minimum. She believed something had gone wrong. In one entry, she described a conversation she overheard outside the shelter. One man told another that she would not last another month, that they should just end it and move on. She wrote that she stopped eating the food left behind after hearing that. She became convinced she was being poisoned or starved slowly. The next pages were filled with hunger logs and notes about rationing. At one point, she described tearing strips from her shirt to soak up condensation from the walls for water. Toward the middle of the journal, Rachel began referring to the man who visited her most often. She called him Pine because of the scent he carried and his boots, which had a distinctive tread. She believed Pine was not in charge but had sympathy. In one entry, she wrote that Pine had left her an extra granola bar when the others were not around. Another time, he entered the shelter without speaking and left behind a jacket that did not fit her but gave her warmth. She speculated Pine was not a monster, but a man trapped by something bigger than himself. The most significant entry was dated 13 days before the final one. Rachel wrote that Pine had spoken for the first time. He whispered 2 words before leaving. He said, "Soon escape." She wrote the words in large letters and underlined them twice. The final page of the journal was dated 3 days after the others. It was a short note, shaky and uneven, likely written in darkness. It said, "If someone finds this and I am gone, know I tried. Know I fought. My name is Rachel Whitaker. I belong to someone. I am not a ghost. I am not a story. I was loved." The page had dried blood in one corner. Lab results would later confirm it was hers. That entry silenced the command trailer. Carlisle stepped outside and stared at the tree line until the agent called him back in. The journal changed the tone of the case again. It painted Rachel not only as a victim, but as someone aware, defiant, and determined to record the truth, even when she knew her time was ending. Simultaneously, a new informant reached out to the FBI tip line from St. Louis. He claimed to have purchased 2 unregistered rifles from a man named Hess months earlier, and had been told that the man's cousin was ex-military and had once handled high-value detainees overseas. The man described a meeting location behind a bait shop off Highway 60, where he had exchanged cash for weapons. He provided a partial plate number of a vehicle used in the transaction. FBI analysts traced the number to a black Ford Bronco registered under a shell company based in Arkansas. The owner on record had no public history, but was linked by address to a woman named Jessica Rourke, sister of the missing deputy. That same night, a surveillance unit parked outside her residence spotted a man matching Rourke's description entering through the back door. The unit called for backup, and within minutes the property was surrounded. Rourke attempted to flee through a back fence but was tackled and subdued. He carried no ID, but had a fresh wound on his side, likely from a fall or sharp object. He was taken into custody and transported to a federal holding facility. During the initial interview, Rourke refused to speak. He sat with his arms crossed and stared straight ahead, but his silence broke when agents showed him a photo of Rachel's final journal entry. His eyes reddened and his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The interview ended when his attorney arrived. Over the following days, Rourke remained silent, but forensic teams recovered a hidden compartment in the Bronco containing a GPS unit maps and 3 burner phones. One of the phones had a message thread between Rourke and an unnamed contact. The last message Rourke had sent read, "I let the dog go." The reply was a single word: mistake. Rourke had knowingly released Buck and had been scolded for it. Investigators now believed Rourke had experienced a shift in loyalty. Whether it was guilt or fear, he had gone against his group. The evidence confirmed that Rachel had likely died within weeks of her final entry. No body had been found, but the journal and blood trace built a compelling narrative. Marlene was informed of the capture at dawn. She arrived at the federal office with Carlisle and sat across from the lead agent as he explained what had been found. When shown the final page of Rachel's journal, Marlene pressed her hand to her mouth and closed her eyes. She requested a copy not for the evidence, but to remember her sister's words. The agent nodded and handed her a digital scan. Marlene read the page slowly and then asked the only question that mattered to her. "Is Nate still alive?" The agent responded carefully. "We have reason to believe he is, but time is against us." The interrogation room was quiet except for the hum of the air vent and the occasional shuffle of paper. Deputy Rourke sat chained at the ankles, his hands cuffed to the steel table. The agents observed him through the glass, noting his posture, the way he shifted only when the room grew cold. He had been in custody for 30 hours and still had not revealed anything beyond his name and rank. But what had shifted was his body language after seeing Rachel's journal. The break in his expression had not gone unnoticed. The lead FBI profiler believed Rourke was carrying a burden that had grown too large to bear. They decided to try a different approach. They showed him a photograph of Nate, not from the search file but from his military days. Rourke looked at the image, then asked for a glass of water. That afternoon, Rourke finally spoke. He did not ask for a deal. He did not demand protection. He simply began talking. His voice was low, hesitant at first, then steadier. He explained that 2 years ago he had been approached by a man he called Dalton, a recruiter from a private network of former military contractors who had ties to militia groups and illegal weapons channels. Dalton offered Rourke a way out of his debts, a chance to belong to something powerful. The entry price was silence and obedience. Rourke agreed, thinking it would be transport runs and minor surveillance. But then he was ordered to help detain someone. That someone was Nate Whitaker. Rourke admitted he had not known the full story until after the kidnapping. Nate had been gathering evidence on arms shipments moving through guard depots across Missouri. He had shared his findings with a contact in the DEA. The network Rourke worked for intercepted this information and deemed Nate a threat. Rachel was not the target, but became one when she insisted on joining Nate for the anniversary trip. The orders had been to secure Nate, erase the trail, and hold him until further instructions. Rachel was considered collateral. Rourke claimed he had not wanted to be involved with her but had no choice. He was assigned to the forest operation along with another man named Eric. That name halted the room. Sheriff Carlisle leaned forward, his mouth tightening. He asked Rourke to repeat it. Rourke confirmed. The man who gave most of the direct orders was named Eric Whitaker. Marlene sat outside the room listening to the recording through a live feed. When she heard the name, her body went rigid. Eric Whitaker was Nate's brother. He had not been seen in nearly a decade, having supposedly moved out west after a falling out with the family. They had not heard from him in years. Carlisle stepped out and asked Marlene to confirm the relationship. She nodded slowly. Eric was 4 years older than Nate. He had served in the Army, left with no ceremony, and had drifted through private security jobs afterward. He had a reputation for being distant and cold, but no one suspected anything like this. Carlisle immediately ordered a search of federal records for Eric Whitaker's last known movements. The FBI pulled up a vehicle registered in Eric's name that had passed through a toll camera 6 weeks earlier on a back road between Missouri and Arkansas. The timestamp aligned with the last confirmed movement of Buck. The image showed a black SUV with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. Facial recognition software matched the driver to Eric Whitaker. The location was within 20 miles of a storage facility that Rourke identified as a safe house used by the network. Agents moved quickly to secure a warrant and launched a raid on the property. The storage facility was nestled behind an old lumber yard, its rusted fence leaning and patched with barbed wire. A dozen units stood in a U-shape, most of them empty. But Unit 7 had signs of recent use. Inside, they found a hidden door behind a wall of stacked crates. The room was dark and soundproofed with old insulation panels. A single cot stood in the corner, stained and worn. On a table were medical supplies, military rations, and notebooks filled with observations. Some were written in Eric's hand. One entry read, "Subject has begun resisting food again." Another read, "Movement restricted to 3 hours per day. Surveillance required overnight." There was no mention of Rachel. Agents expanded the perimeter and found a shallow trench behind the facility. Inside was a lockbox containing multiple IDs, passports, and USB drives. One of the drives held surveillance footage. The grainy files showed Nate in various states of confinement, often sitting silently in a corner or pacing. The last video, dated 3 weeks earlier, showed Nate looking directly at the camera and holding up a note. It read, "I am still alive." That message reignited the urgency. For the first time since the initial days of the case, everyone moved with renewed purpose. Marlene was shown the footage in a separate room. She pressed her hand to the monitor and whispered her brother's name, her voice barely audible. Later that day, forensic analysis confirmed Eric had been on site as recently as 10 days prior. Fingerprints matched both the cot and the medical supplies. Rourke, when confronted with the new evidence, finally spoke again. He said he had tried to help, that he had given Nate books, had brought him news articles, and that he had released Buck in a moment of weakness. He claimed Eric had grown unstable, paranoid, and increasingly cruel. The group's leadership had lost patience, and Eric had taken full control. Rourke believed Nate was no longer at the facility. He guessed Eric had moved him again, likely to a more isolated location deeper in the Ozarks. The FBI analyzed Eric's known habits, contacts, and favorite hiking zones. A pattern emerged near the western ridge near land once owned by their grandfather. Carlisle remembered the property. It had been abandoned since the late 90s. A search team was organized immediately. Drones were launched, thermal imaging set up, and field units deployed with medics in tow. The land was rough with overgrown trails and no marked roads. As darkness fell, they began their approach, flashlights sweeping the forest floor for signs. Behind one outcropping, they found a smoldering fire pit. A rusted metal pot sat in the ashes. Steam still rose. They had just missed someone. The western ridge above the old Whitaker property was treacherous in daylight and nearly impossible to navigate in the dark. Thickets of thorn bushes snagged on boots and pant legs, while uneven limestone outcroppings threatened every step. The search team moved slowly, carefully, guided by GPS coordinates and instinct. At the front of the formation was Agent Monroe, an experienced tracker with over a decade in field operations. He paused when he noticed a pattern in the underbrush. Grass flattened in a straight line. Footsteps. The direction led them up a slope where the trees thinned and the ground leveled out slightly. There, hidden beneath a fallen cedar, was a trapdoor, made from weathered boards and covered in moss. One agent knelt beside it and pressed his ear against the wood. A faint sound echoed upward. It was not mechanical, it was human. A cough weak and dry, followed by the unmistakable creak of metal against metal. The team pulled the boards away and pried the door open. A rush of stale air hit them thick with mold and sweat. The passage was narrow, no more than 4 feet across, descending in a spiral into the limestone. The walls were reinforced with sheet metal and wooden beams. Agent Monroe led the way, his flashlight slicing through the dark. At the bottom was a small room, barely large enough for 3 people. A thin mattress lay against the wall, and beside it, hunched over and shielding his eyes from the light, was Nate Whitaker. His face was sunken, his hair long and tangled, and his wrists bore the marks of prolonged restraint. He blinked slowly as the light touched him, his lips cracking as he tried to speak. No one moved at first. Then Monroe lowered his weapon and said his name softly. Nate. Paramedics moved quickly. They checked his vitals, started an IV, and covered him with thermal blankets. Nate's voice came in broken fragments. He asked for Rachel. He asked for Buck. He asked if this was real. Agent Monroe knelt beside him and told him it was over. Nate stared at the ceiling for several seconds before nodding once and closing his eyes. They carried him up the spiral passage, slowly lifting his fragile body with care. As they emerged from the tunnel, dawn was beginning to break across the Ozarks. Light painted the treetops orange and gold, and for a brief moment, everything felt still. A helicopter touched down in a nearby clearing, and Nate was loaded inside. Before the doors closed, he looked up at Monroe and whispered something. Monroe leaned in to hear. Nate had said, "Thank you for coming." At the hospital in Springfield, doctors assessed Nate's condition. He was severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from multiple infections. His left foot showed early signs of necrosis from poor circulation. But he was alive. That single fact echoed through the command center like a drumbeat. Marlene arrived within hours. When she entered the room, Nate opened his eyes and reached out a trembling hand. She clasped it, tears sliding down her cheeks. He asked again for Rachel, and this time she could not answer. She only shook her head slowly. Nate turned his face away and closed his eyes. Later that day, Nate began speaking in short bursts, his voice ragged and low. He described how he had been moved multiple times, always at night, always with a blindfold. The rooms were different, but the rules remained the same. No questions, no noise, no escape. Eric had visited him regularly, not as a brother, but as a captor. He spoke in riddles about legacy and betrayal, about enemies in the government and purging weakness. Nate tried to reason with him, but Eric would not be moved. He was lost in a world of conspiracy and control. One night after Rachel had died, Eric brought Buck into the room. He said the dog would be the last witness. Then he strapped a vest to him, placed a USB inside, and let him go. Nate never knew if Buck had made it. he had only hope. The FBI debriefed Nate, carefully extracting names, locations, and habits. Nate recalled a place Eric had spoken about once. A cabin high above a river bend, accessible only by foot, and hidden behind a curtain of pine. He believed it was the final meeting point, the one reserved for high-ranking members of the network. Maps confirmed such a place existed near the 11-Point River. A tactical team was dispatched that evening. When they arrived, the cabin was empty, but inside they found documents, flash drives, and communication devices. One handwritten note, signed with a symbol rather than a name, contained a list of targets: law enforcement officers, judges, and federal agents. The operation went far beyond Nate's abduction. This had been part of a long-term agenda. Forensics teams combed through the data, tracing encrypted emails and calls. Arrests began across 3 states. 12 individuals were taken into custody within 48 hours, all linked to the militia network. Charges ranged from weapons trafficking to conspiracy to commit murder. The FBI called it one of the largest domestic terror stings in a decade. At the center of it all stood the testimony of a man who had been presumed dead. Nate gave interviews from his hospital bed, speaking not of revenge, but of vigilance. He warned of the quiet spread of hate and the cost of silence. His words carried weight. People listened. On the 3rd day of his recovery, a nurse brought in a familiar companion. Buck limped into the room, tail wagging gently. His eyes locked on Nate, and for a moment neither moved. Then Buck padded forward and rested his head on Nate's chest. Nate whispered his name, barely audible. Buck gave a soft whine and closed his eyes. They stayed like that for nearly an hour. Staff members passed by the door, pausing to take in the scene. A survivor and his dog reunited after an unimaginable trial. 2 days after Nate's rescue, the FBI set up a secure debriefing room on the 7th floor of the hospital, just down the hall from his recovery suite. Though still weak, Nate insisted on speaking directly with investigators. He sat in a wheelchair, a blanket over his lap, a fire still connected to his arm. His voice was hoarse and unsteady, but his focus remained sharp. For 3 hours, he described in meticulous detail the structure of the militia network, naming individuals he had seen or overheard, identifying signals, phrases, meeting times, and patterns of movement. He recalled hand-drawn maps, the types of encrypted radios used, and even the scent markers Eric had taught others to use for locating shelters in dense forest. What stunned agents most was Nate's clarity. Despite the trauma and time, he had stored everything he could remember. He said that was what kept him sane. He had promised himself he would bring it all back, that Rachel's death would not disappear into silence. His most critical revelation involved a name no one had connected before. During one transfer, Nate had been kept in a shed near a creek for 3 days. There, he overheard a man receiving a call from someone referred to as the Colonel. The voice on the other end gave orders, referred to dates, and listed payments already received. Nate remembered the voice's tone, clipped and authoritative, but what stood out was a phrase used twice: Operation Revival. The FBI analysts froze when he said it. That code phrase had surfaced months earlier in an unrelated investigation involving illegal arms stockpiles in rural Kentucky. Now, with Nate's confirmation, the link was no longer speculative. Operation Revival was the unifying doctrine behind a much larger movement. Meanwhile, across the region, federal agents were working around the clock. Raids in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Illinois had yielded weapons caches, encrypted devices, and even underground rooms similar to the one where Nate had been found. Every location included documents referencing Eric Whitaker, either by full name or alias. He had built a reputation inside the organization as a ghost commander, someone who never appeared on record but pulled strings from behind the scenes. With Rourke in custody and Nate now a living witness, the net had tightened. The only missing piece was Eric himself. He had vanished without a trace. Sheriff Carlisle, now working closely with federal authorities, traveled to St. Louis to meet with the task force leaders. He brought with him a case file from 1999, one that had never been digitized. Inside were reports about a fire on the Whitaker family property, one that had destroyed an outbuilding used as a workshop. Eric had been suspected of setting the fire, but no charges had ever been filed. Among the old documents was a report from a neighbor who described hearing Eric shouting about betrayal and judgment just before the flames started. Carlisle believed that moment had been the start of Eric's spiral. He handed over the file, convinced that understanding Eric's past would unlock his present whereabouts. Back at the hospital, Marlene sat by Nate's bedside most nights. Sometimes they talked quietly, other times they simply sat in silence. Nate had grown thinner still since the rescue, a result of refeeding complications that doctors were monitoring carefully. His body had not processed nutrients properly after so much deprivation, but his mind remained clear. He asked about Buck, often making sure the dog was comfortable, asking if he was eating. Marlene brought pictures each morning. One night, Nate asked her about the last day she saw Rachel. Marlene described how Rachel had smiled at the gas station before leaving town, how she had waved without knowing it would be the last time. Nate cried quietly, then not sobbing, but with tears that moved slowly down his face, silent and endless. The turning point came when one of the seized phones revealed a recent message sent through a hidden network. The message was short. Extraction delayed. Whitaker compromised. Move fallback to Bell Creek. That name triggered a memory for Carlisle. Bell Creek was a dried-up streambed west of the 11-Point River, once used as a logging route. The area had not been surveyed in decades. Federal teams mobilized immediately. They scanned the region by air and found heat signatures near a thicket of rock formations. A tactical unit was deployed under the cover of night. They reached the site at dawn. Hidden beneath camouflaged tarps, agents found a temporary camp with solar batteries, encrypted radios, and 2 armed guards. The standoff lasted less than 5 minutes. The guards surrendered. In the center of the camp was a tent reinforced with soundproof insulation. Inside, they found a woman named Lillian Ward, a former military nurse believed to have disappeared 4 years earlier. She had been helping the group with medical care. She refused to speak at first, then finally asked for proof that Nate was alive. When shown a photo, she cried and said he had never stopped trying. She confirmed Eric had moved east, possibly using an old smuggling trail near the river. Nate was informed about the camp discovery the next morning. His eyes narrowed when he heard Lillian's name. He said she had once treated his wounds and had hidden antibiotics in a hollowed-out book. She had risked her position to keep him alive. He asked if she had been harmed. When told she was safe and in custody, he closed his eyes and nodded once. He asked no questions about Eric. That afternoon, a letter arrived at the hospital. It had no return address but was postmarked from within the state. The handwriting was erratic, but the name signed at the bottom was Eric. The letter was 1 page long. In it, Eric called Nate a traitor, accused him of aligning with the wrong people, and warned that what was coming could not be stopped. There was no apology, no regret, only doctrine. At the end, Eric wrote one sentence that made the FBI issue an immediate alert. "You took away my army, so I will take away your peace." Marlene read the letter and said nothing. She walked it into Nate's room and placed it in the drawer beside his bed without comment. The morning was unusually still at the Whitaker family home, a modest one-story house just outside Springfield, where the porch sagged slightly and the grass grew too long around the mailbox. Marlene sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee between her hands, watching the second hand tick across the clock face. The silence of the house reminded her of the early days after Rachel vanished, when every sound felt like it might mean something, and every silence seemed unbearable. Now the silence felt different. It felt like breath being held before a storm. She had spent the last week at Nate's side in the hospital, watching him grow stronger each day, watching color return to his face, watching the weight of memory settle behind his eyes. He spoke rarely, now not out of fear or trauma, but out of precision. He chose his words carefully as if each one carried weight. When he did speak, he asked about the search. He asked if Eric had been found. Marlene answered honestly, "No, not yet." The FBI had expanded their perimeter another 30 miles east, following the discovery of the Bell Creek camp. Surveillance footage from a gas station near the Missouri-Arkansas border had captured a man resembling Eric buying fuel and canned goods 2 days before the camp was raided. The timestamp aligned with a message intercepted by federal agents referencing a fallback route known as the Eagle Trail, a rugged path through the hills used decades ago by moonshiners. The trail connected to several abandoned properties, including one formerly leased to a man using a false identity that investigators later tied to Eric Whitaker. Drones were deployed over the ridge, but heavy tree cover made detection difficult. Ground teams moved in cautiously wary of traps or resistance. They found the hideout at dawn on a Thursday. A simple A-frame cabin nestled behind 2 rows of cedar trees, its roof partially caved, and a rusted satellite dish perched like a sentinel on the chimney. No smoke rose from the flue. No lights flickered inside. The team approached in silence, circling to cover all exits. When they breached the front door, they found the cabin empty. The floor was covered in dirt and dried pine needles. A chair stood in the center of the room facing a makeshift altar of books and handwritten notes. On the table sat an old tape recorder, the kind used in classrooms decades ago. One agent pressed play. Eric's voice filled the room, calm and detached. He spoke of legacy of betrayal, of false justice. He never mentioned Nate by name, but referred to him only as the brother who forgot his place. He spoke of networks rising again, of patience being rewarded. The recording ended with a line that chilled every agent in the room. "You may capture my name, but you will never capture the message." The room fell silent. The team searched the cabin for clues, and behind a loose wall panel they found a USB drive wrapped in cloth. Inside were hundreds of files, detailed plans, diagrams, and names. It was the final piece. With the drive's contents, the FBI dismantled the remaining factions within 2 weeks. Back at the hospital, Nate was briefed privately. He listened without speaking. When the agents finished, he asked one question. "Is he dead?" The answer was honest. "We cannot confirm. No body was found." Nate nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the sky had turned overcast. He thanked the agents and returned to his physical therapy session without another word. That night, he asked Marlene to bring him Rachel's journals. He spent hours reading them again, tracing each word with his fingers. He paused longest on the final entry. "I am not a ghost. I am not a story. I was loved." He whispered the words back to himself over and over until his voice broke. 2 months later, Nate was discharged from the hospital. He walked slowly, aided by a cane, and carried visible scars on his hands and face. But he stood upright. He stood in sunlight. He returned to the family home where Marlene had prepared Rachel's old study for him. He filled it with folders and photographs, with maps and printouts. He began writing a book. It was not about revenge. It was about truth. He called it The Fire That Did Not Burn. He said it was for Rachel, for everyone taken, for everyone dismissed as lost. Each morning he walked with Buck along the trail behind the house. The dog moved slower now, graying around the eyes, but his steps remained steady. They walked in silence, the kind that asked nothing and offered everything. Sometimes they stopped at the edge of the woods where the trees closed in like old secrets, and Nate would stare into the distance as if listening for something only he could hear. Then he would kneel beside Buck, scratch behind his ears, and whisper something only the dog could understand. The book was published the following spring. It climbed bestseller lists slowly but steadily, propelled not by marketing, but by word of mouth. People read it and passed it on. Survivors wrote letters to Nate. Families of the missing thanked him for reminding the world that names are not just names. They are lives. They are people. The final chapter of the book contained Rachel's journal entry printed in full. Below it, Nate wrote one sentence. "She died remembering who she was. That is how we win." In May, Nate was invited to speak before a congressional hearing on domestic extremism. He declined at first, citing fatigue, but eventually agreed under one condition. He would speak only once, and he would not answer questions. The chamber was silent as he stepped to the podium. Cameras clicked. Journalists held their pens above paper. Nate adjusted the microphone and began. He spoke not as a victim, but as a witness. He described the darkness, the silence, the slow erasure of identity. He described the strength it took to remember his name when no one said it for months. He spoke of Rachel. He said her name aloud 3 times. He said she mattered. He said he was not there to tell stories of cruelty, but to remind them of what silence enables. He ended by asking the room to remember the names of the forgotten, not because they were victims, but because they resisted being erased. The room rose in applause, but Nate had already stepped down. That summer, a small plaque was placed at the edge of the woods behind the Whitaker home. It bore Rachel's name, her birth and death year, and a short inscription. "I was not a ghost. I was not a story. I was loved." Beneath it lay a small stone where Buck would sometimes rest his head. Nate visited the spot daily, sitting in the same chair he once used for hunting. He no longer hunted. He said he had taken enough from the forest. Now he just listened. One evening in August, as the sky turned gold and the cicadas sang, Marlene found Nate in the garden. Rachel once planted. He was kneeling in the soil, hands covered in dirt, a single tomato vine between his fingers. She asked what he was doing. He looked up and said Rachel loved these. She nodded and sat beside him. They stayed there as the light faded, 2 survivors remembering not the terror, but the things that made life full before it broke. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like and subscribe for more true-to-life narratives that stay with you long after they end. Let us know in the comments what you thought about the plot and where you are watching from. We read every response.